October 1998 arrived crisp and golden in the Colorado Rockies. The air carried that sharp autumn chill that makes every breath feel cleaner, colder, almost electric. The San Juan Mountains were painted in deep shades of orange and red, the aspen leaves trembling in the wind like flickering fire. It was the kind of weekend that hikers wait all year for: clear skies, cool temperatures, and miles of quiet wilderness untouched by the noise of the world. Ethan Harper had been planning the trip for weeks. At 29 years old, he worked long hours as a mechanical technician in Denver, and this was his escape. His wife, Lila, 27, loved the outdoors just as much. Friends described them as careful, responsible, and experienced. They weren't thrill-seekers chasing danger. They were methodical planners. They checked weather forecasts, studied trail maps, and even left a printed itinerary on their kitchen counter before leaving home. The Pine Hollow Trail wasn't considered extreme. Moderate difficulty. Well-marked paths. Popular enough to feel safe, but remote enough to feel adventurous. On Friday afternoon, they loaded their dark green Ford Explorer with camping gear, extra water, protein bars, and a small first aid kit. Lila insisted on packing an emergency whistle and thermal blankets. Just in case, she always said. They laughed as they pulled out of their driveway, windows cracked open, mountain air waiting for them just a few hours away. According to a gas station clerk near Durango, they seemed relaxed when they stopped to refuel. Ethan paid in cash. Lila grabbed 2 coffees and a folded trail brochure from the counter display. They arrived at Pine Hollow Trailhead just before sunset. Other hikers later told investigators they saw the couple standing near a wooden map board, pointing toward the North Ridge route. Ethan had a camera hanging from his neck. Lila wore a red flannel shirt over a gray thermal top, her brown hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Nothing about them stood out as unusual. No arguments. No tension. Just another couple beginning a weekend hike beneath a sky slowly turning purple. As darkness settled over the mountains, temperatures dropped fast. The forest grew quieter, the usual daytime chatter of birds replaced by the distant rustling of wind through pine needles. Somewhere along that trail, beyond the marked signs, beyond the first scenic overlook, Ethan and Lila took their first steps into the deeper stretch of wilderness. The path narrowed. The trees grew thicker, and the sounds of the parking lot faded completely behind them. Monday morning came and went without anyone noticing. It wasn't unusual for hikers to lose track of time in the mountains. But by late Monday night, when Ethan didn't show up for work and Lila failed to call her sister like she always did after a trip, concern quietly began to grow. By Tuesday afternoon, that concern had turned into something heavier, something harder to ignore. Lila's sister contacted local authorities, explaining that the couple had planned only a short weekend hike and were supposed to return Sunday evening. They were responsible, predictable, the kind of people who always checked in. Early Wednesday morning, a park ranger doing routine patrol near Pine Hollow Trailhead noticed something odd. A dark green Ford Explorer sat alone in the gravel parking lot. Most hikers came and went quickly during that season, especially with colder weather approaching. But this SUV looked like it hadn't moved in days. A thin layer of dust had settled across the windshield. Fallen aspen leaves were trapped under the wiper blades. The ranger circled the vehicle slowly before checking the license plate. It matched the missing persons report filed just hours earlier. The doors were locked. There were no broken windows. No visible damage. Through the glass, the ranger could see hiking gear neatly stacked in the back seat, an extra backpack, folded blankets, and a sealed container of trail mix. In the center console sat a pair of sunglasses and a folded map. On the passenger seat, Lila's denim jacket was draped casually, as if she had taken it off moments before stepping out. Nothing looked rushed. Nothing looked disturbed. It was almost too normal. When investigators arrived, they carefully opened the vehicle. Ethan's wallet was inside, along with his driver's license and credit cards. Lila's purse was tucked beneath the passenger seat, her phone still inside, battery long dead. A half-empty thermos of coffee rested in the cup holder, the lid screwed on tight. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood. No broken items. It looked like 2 people had simply parked, stepped out to begin a hike, and vanished before they ever made it back. But what unsettled authorities most was what wasn't there. No note explaining a change of plans. No text message drafts. No signs they intended to camp longer than planned. The vehicle sat facing the mountain trail entrance, as if waiting patiently for its owners to return. And beyond the tree line, the Pine Hollow Trail stretched into miles of dense forest, quiet, shadowed, and completely silent. Within hours of confirming the abandoned SUV belonged to Ethan and Lila Harper, Pine Hollow Trail transformed from a peaceful hiking destination into an active search zone. Sheriff's deputies, park rangers, and trained search and rescue teams flooded the area. Bright orange vests moved through the tree line as officers marked grids on topographic maps. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades slicing through the cold mountain air. The sound echoed through the valleys, breaking a silence that had likely settled there days earlier. The first search teams followed the main trail north, tracing the exact route the couple had reportedly pointed to at the trailhead. For the first mile, everything seemed ordinary. Boot prints were visible in the dirt, some fresh, some older. But after a short distance, the ground turned rocky and uneven. Footprints became impossible to track. Dogs were brought in to pick up a scent from clothing taken out of the SUV. At first, the K9 units seemed confident, pulling handlers deeper into the forest. Then suddenly, near a narrow ridge overlooking a steep drop, the dogs became confused. They circled, whined, and then stopped entirely. Rescue crews searched ravines that plunged hundreds of feet into shadow. They rappelled down cliffs, scanned riverbanks, and checked beneath fallen trees. If the Harpers had slipped or fallen, there should have been something: torn fabric, broken branches, disturbed soil. But every location they inspected felt untouched. Pristine. It was as if no one had passed through at all. Even the experienced search leaders admitted something felt off. The mountain wasn't giving up any clues. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded outward. Volunteers joined, forming long human chains to sweep sections of forest floor. Thermal imaging cameras were used at night. Campgrounds within a 50-mile radius were questioned. No one remembered seeing the couple after that first evening. No ranger station recorded their exit. No hikers reported hearing screams or spotting abandoned gear. It was like they had stepped beyond the visible world and into something unseen. Then the weather shifted. A brutal early snowstorm rolled through the San Juan mountains, dumping heavy snow across the trails. Temperatures dropped below freezing overnight. The forest that had already hidden its secrets was now buried beneath ice and white silence. Search efforts slowed, then stalled. Helicopters were grounded. Trails became impassable. And slowly, the organized urgency began to fade into cold uncertainty as the mountains stood still, untouched and unreadable. When official search efforts slowed and media coverage began to fade, something else quietly took its place: rumors. Pine Hollow Trail had always been considered peaceful, but after the Harper disappearance, locals started looking at it differently. The forest didn't feel like just a stretch of trees anymore. It felt watchful. Older residents in nearby towns began recalling stories that hadn't seemed important before: hikers who wandered off trail and were never found, strange calls to ranger stations that led nowhere, unexplained incidents brushed off as accidents. At a small diner 20 miles from the trailhead, conversations shifted whenever someone mentioned the Harpers. An elderly man who claimed to have grown up exploring those mountains said certain areas of Pine Hollow were wrong. He described spots where compasses would spin slightly off true north, where the air felt heavier, and where sound seemed strangely muted. Most people dismissed him as superstitious. But after Ethan and Lila vanished without leaving a single trace, even skeptics listened a little more carefully. Hunters who had roamed those woods for decades admitted there were patches of forest they avoided. Not because of wildlife, but because of a feeling they couldn't explain. One hunter told deputies he once heard what sounded like distant voices calling out late at night, even though he knew he was alone. Another reported seeing faint lights moving between trees far from any campsite. None of it could be proven. None of it was officially documented. But the stories persisted, spreading quietly from porch to porch, from gas station counters to ranger offices. Online forums began picking up the case years later. Amateur investigators combed through archived news articles and satellite images, speculating about hidden caves, illegal camps deep in the forest, or even long-forgotten mining tunnels from the 1800s. Some believed the Harpers had stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. Others theorized about secret gatherings rumored to occur in isolated mountain regions. The more time passed without answers, the more elaborate the theories became. Yet for all the whispers and speculation, law enforcement maintained there was no evidence of foul play. Officially, it remained a tragic hiking disappearance, likely exposure, likely an accident. But privately, even some investigators admitted the lack of physical evidence disturbed them. No remains, no damaged gear, not even scattered belongings carried by animals. Just two experienced hikers who stepped into a well-known mountain trail and seemed to dissolve into thin air, leaving behind a silence that felt deeper than the forest itself. By the summer of 2023, the Harper case had become little more than a footnote in Colorado's long list of unsolved disappearances. The original investigators had retired. Newspaper articles were archived behind dusty digital paywalls. For most people, Ethan and Lila were just names attached to an old mystery. The Pine Hollow Trail had returned to normal. Families hiking, couples taking photos, college students camping beneath the same trees that once framed a massive search operation. The mountain had moved on. Then, in late July, the weather turned violent. A sudden, powerful windstorm tore through the San Juan Mountains with almost no warning. Meteorologists later described it as a microburst, intense, concentrated winds strong enough to snap mature pine trees in half. Gusts reached nearly 90 miles per hour. Campgrounds were evacuated. Trails were temporarily closed. By morning, entire sections of forest looked rearranged. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted, their massive root systems clawing up earth and rock. When the storm finally passed, local volunteers organized cleanup crews to help clear blocked paths. Chainsaws echoed through the mountains as fallen trees were cut and dragged aside. Rangers focused first on the main routes, but one small team was assigned to inspect an older, lesser-used stretch of land about 2 miles off the primary Pine Hollow path, an area rarely visited even during peak hiking season. That's when one of the volunteers noticed something strange. About 30 yards off the damaged trail, a tall pine tree still stood upright, oddly untouched compared to the chaos around it. But high in its upper branches, something unnatural caught the sunlight. At first, the volunteer assumed it was debris carried by the storm, maybe a tarp or a shredded camping tent. But as he stepped closer, squinting against the glare, he realized the shapes were too defined. Too structured. Fabric. Hanging fabric. He called out to the others. The forest suddenly felt very quiet again. Authorities sealed off the area within hours of the volunteer's call. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered between trees as deputies and forensic teams carefully moved through the brush. The tall pine stood in the center of a small clearing, its trunk straight and undamaged despite the surrounding storm destruction. And there, nearly 15 feet above the ground, tangled among thick branches, were pieces of clothing swaying gently in the afternoon wind. A ladder was brought in. A forensic technician climbed slowly, each step deliberate. The forest floor below was examined first. No drag marks, no footprints preserved in the hardened soil, no sign that anyone had recently stood there long enough to hang something so carefully. When the technician finally reached the branches, the reality became unmistakable. A red flannel shirt, faded but intact. A pair of women's hiking pants, weathered yet not shredded. Fabric stiff from years of exposure, but strangely preserved. One by one, the items were lowered in sealed evidence bags. On the ground, investigators laid them out side by side. The boots were the most disturbing. A men's pair and a women's pair, both laced tightly as if they had just been taken off. No animal bite marks. No tearing. The soles showed wear consistent with hiking terrain, but nothing suggesting a fall from a cliff or violent attack. It didn't look like clothing ripped away in panic. It looked removed. When DNA testing results came back weeks later, there was no doubt. The fibers carried genetic traces that matched samples taken from Ethan and Lila's family decades earlier. The odds of coincidence were almost impossible. After 25 years, something from that mountain finally belonged to them. But the discovery answered none of the real questions. In fact, it created more. Because the way the clothes were positioned unsettled even veteran investigators. The shirt wasn't thrown carelessly over a branch, it was draped. The pants were looped in a way that suggested intention. As if someone had taken the time to climb that tree and arrange them. There were no nearby bones. No scattered remains buried beneath roots. No signs that scavengers had disturbed anything. Just a quiet pine tree holding clothing that should have been on 2 people who were never found. The discovery should have brought closure. After 25 years of silence, investigators finally had physical evidence connected to Ethan and Lila Harper. But instead of relief, the case reopened like an old wound. Detectives who weren't even born when the couple disappeared were now studying grainy photos from 1998, listening to archived interviews, retracing the original search routes through a forest that had changed with time. The question that echoed through every briefing room was the same. If the Harpers died on that mountain, how did their clothes end up 15 feet in the air? Forensic analysts examined every inch of fabric under microscopes. They searched for skin cells from an unknown individual, foreign fibers, tool marks, anything that could suggest another person's involvement. The results were frustratingly limited. Time had degraded most trace evidence. There were no clear fingerprints. No DNA from a stranger. The clothing showed signs of long-term exposure to wind, sun, and snow, but not the kind of damage you would expect if it had been violently torn away. It looked as though it had been placed there deliberately and left undisturbed for decades. Investigators returned to the tree itself. They studied the bark for signs of climbing equipment, rope friction, or carved footholds. Nothing stood out. The trunk was rough but climbable, though not easily, and certainly not without leaving some kind of trace. The surrounding soil was analyzed for disturbances beneath layers of sediment. Again, nothing conclusive. No buried remains. No hidden campsite. No indication that someone had been living secretly in that section of forest. The pine stood alone, offering no explanation for what it held. Theories multiplied quickly. Some believed the Harpers had encountered foul play, that someone else had been on that mountain in 1998 and returned years later to stage a grim reminder. Others suggested the clothes had been hidden somewhere nearby for years and only recently blown into the tree during the storm. But that explanation didn't sit well with investigators. The way the fabric was looped and draped didn't look random. It didn't look like something carried by wind. It looked intentional, thoughtful, almost symbolic. And then there was the timeline. If someone placed those clothes in that tree, why wait 25 years? Why choose that specific location, off a rarely used path? Why leave no message, no threat, no demand? Detectives revisited every person connected to the Harpers, friends, co-workers, distant relatives. They re-examined old tips that had once seemed insignificant. Yet even with modern technology and fresh eyes on the case, one reality remained unchanged. Two experienced hikers entered the San Juan Mountains in October 1998, and something happened between the trailhead and that silent pine tree that no one has been able to explain. For 25 years, the San Juan Mountains kept their silence. They stood through blizzards, wildfires, and passing seasons, guarding whatever happened beyond that narrow trail. Families searched for answers. Investigators chased dead ends. Time moved forward, but the mountain never spoke. And then, just when the world had almost forgotten, it gave something back. Not bones. Not a confession. Not the truth. Just clothes, hanging high in a tree, swaying in the wind like a message no one can fully understand. Maybe Ethan and Lila lost their way. Maybe they stumbled onto something they were never meant to see. Or maybe someone out there knows exactly what happened that October night, and has stayed silent ever since. Because the most unsettling part of this mystery isn't what was found. It's what's still missing. 2 bodies. 1 explanation. And the reason their final trace was left 15 feet above the ground. Somewhere in the Colorado wilderness, that pine tree is still standing. And every time the wind moves through its branches, it sounds almost like a whisper.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.